Introduction. When the disciple is ready, the Guru appears, is a common saying among occultists and is often repeated in the literature. For a quarter of a century, the writer kept trying to believe this statement. But he often wondered if it was literally true, or was it just an optimistic expression of those few who had succeeded in finding one. For a quarter of a century, he had believed in the existence of the Guru, the Master, the genuine Mahatma. God knows there was plenty of need for them. If they did not exist, there was in the economy of human life a decided deficiency. If one accepts the major premise of a supreme and benevolent Creator, whose fundamental nature is love, then he can scarcely believe that Creator would leave untold billions of his children to wander around like babes in a wilderness, unguided, unenlightened, and unprotected. If he sent us down into this world for some beneficent purpose, then he cannot fail to look after us, and to see that his purposes are ultimately conserved. There simply must be masters. That is our first and root conviction. They are necessary to any rational order in this world. Without them, there is chaos, only blind drifting and chance. Nothing but hopes and vague uncertainties, groping speculations. Excepting the masters and their disciples, there is not a man or woman in all the world who has any certain knowledge concerning the most important problems of the soul, or even of the existence of the soul itself. All the rest only believe, imagine, speculate, and preach. Only the masters know. Without the revelations of masters, living masters, not the story of masters written in books, the origin of which no man can tell, without the certain knowledge that they possess, the scientific student is almost driven to the conclusion that man is only a physical structure, beginning with a fetus in utero and ending in the dissolution of death. He may conjure up dreams to please his fancy and feed his imagination, but they are hardly worth his time. Without the masters, there is no provision for the soul of man. If the Creator has made no provision to properly instruct and take care of the spirit, then there is no spirit. But happily, we are not left in the dark concerning these things. There are men who know. To say that the people have a book to guide them is futile, when but a small fraction of the human race has ever had access to any one book, and there is no general agreement as to the value of any book as a guide. To say that they have priests and other religious leaders to guide them is likewise futile, even ridiculous, in the light of the well-known fact that those teachers are practically all in the dark themselves, leading worldly lives and driven by the 5 common passions, just like other men. Besides, they are utterly lacking in any sort of agreement among themselves as to the most fundamental principles or precepts by which they propose to guide their followers. To say that they have a divine spirit to guide them is only a guess, a dogma. If that were the case, then the whole world would truly be guided aright, and the results would be uniform and highly salutary. Spiritual enlightenment would be universal. So it is evident that this old world sadly needs real masters, who alone of all men can speak from positive knowledge. For that is the one supreme mark of distinction between masters and all other teachers. They know, all others only believe. Always one master on earth. And so it stands out as a vital fact, well known to those who have had the experience, that the great Supreme Father, in his loving kindness, has provided that there shall always be at least one perfect saint or master on earth in the physical body, ready to guide all who are ready to go with him. And no matter where on earth a soul may be, even to the remotest islands of the sea, and no matter what his handicap or difficulties, if he makes himself ready for the Master by always doing the best he can under the circumstances, the very day and hour he is fit to stand before the Master and is ready to follow him in the right spirit, as certain as the path of a planet in its orbit, just as certainly will the Master appear and take charge of his pupil. No matter how the meeting is to be brought about, that may be left entirely to the Master. His wisdom and power are all sufficient, for he is the Viceroy of the Supreme King, appointed to do that specific work among men. The only concern of the student is to make himself ready. A long and thorny path. But the way to the Master's feet is often a long and thorny path. Many are the weary years when doubts spring up and the heart grows faint, when hope is no more than a flickering candle to guide our sore and aching feet. It often happens that a person struggles on for years amidst his doubts and perplexities, groping blindly as it seems to him, when at last, just as he passes a turn in the road, suddenly and unexpectedly he stands face to face with realization. Then he is ready to exclaim with Cooper, "God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform." A sketch of my life. I was brought up in a most orthodox environment. When I was a boy, the sermons in the Baptist church where I attended fairly smelled of brimstone, and anyone who was not converted and baptized by immersion was pretty sure of immersion in that lake that burned with unquenchable fire. But there were many questions I wanted to ask, only those questions were generally settled by the indignant assertion that the old devil was putting doubts into my mind. As a boy, I was reading and explaining the Bible to everyone. There was no mystery about it. Only I found out later that some of my explanations were not to be tolerated. These were quite unorthodox, and everything unorthodox was of the devil. The book of Revelation was one of my favourites. I knew all about it, even though many of the world's greatest scholars never claimed so much. However, only a few days ago I picked up the New Testament and read that portion again to see if my later studies had thrown any light upon it. I found, somewhat to my amazement, that now I had not the slightest idea of its meaning. I wonder if the writer himself had any clear conception of it. Licensed to preach at 17. At the age of 17, I was licensed to preach and spent the next 17 years trying to convince the world that the Baptist Church was a divinely commissioned organ of the Almighty for the enlightenment and salvation of mankind. At 22, I was graduated from college at Bolivar, Missouri, from which school I obtained 3 degrees, and was then appointed a missionary to India. That ancient land always held a peculiar fascination for me. As a boy, even the map of India held me spellbound. Now I was sorry for India and would go out and set her right in matters of religion. I was not then aware of the fact that the great men of India were adepts in religion and spiritual science, ages before my own country was discovered by civilized man, even when my ancestors were pirates along the northern coasts of Europe. But I was young, optimistic, and egoistic. Nothing daunted, I set out to convert the world. But after nearly 3 years in India, I returned to America with my orthodox egotism a bit deflated. I was like an automobile tyre with a small puncture, a little flat, but still going. I had met a few men in India, although they were not masters, who knew so much more about everything than I did that I was mystified, amazed, amazed not so much at my own ignorance as at their massive learning. I had come to India to convert ignorant heathen, but by the side of some of them, I was still in the primer class. I had my 3 diplomas tucked away in the trunk, and I never showed them to anybody after that. I had gone out to convert the heathen, and the heathen had set me to thinking, even if they had not converted me. I was born with an irrepressible desire for knowledge. At least it was very early manifest. My mother used to call me the standing interrogation point. I just must know the ins and outs of things, the whys and the wherefores. I never could accept complacently what was dished out to me and ask no questions. And this trait of character has often got me into trouble. It has always been quite impossible for me to fit myself into a nice little stall someplace and eat my hay along with the rest. First, I wanted to analyse a sample of the hay, and that a good horse is not supposed to do. I never could take gracefully to the harness while some archbishop sat up in the chariot behind me with his whip in hand. 5 years of intensive search. Determined to get my feet on solid ground, if possible, in matters of mind and soul, I entered school again, this time in the great University of Chicago. There I spent 5 years in an intensive search for reality, graduating in 2 different departments, one of which was theology. But my graduating thesis was a disappointment to my dear Orthodox professors. I chose as my theme the fundamental principle of the Reformation. I took the position that the real source and inspiration of the Renaissance and of the Protestant Reformation in Europe was the great principle of individual liberty, reborn and now asserting itself, in spite of all church dogmas, both Catholic and Protestant. The fact that a few great Protestant leaders, themselves only half liberated from the tyranny of dogma, took a leading part in the general awakening by no means obliged us to ascribe to their teachings the real source of the Renaissance. They themselves were the unconscious agents of a greater and deeper principle, of a far more gigantic force, which was now moving all Europe and the world. But my beloved professors were deeply grieved that I did not attribute the Great Awakening to the dogmas of the Baptist Church. Their labour of love had been wasted upon me. I was hopelessly led astray by German rationalism. Much was the pity. But as for myself, I was in a worse predicament than a man on the highway with a flat tyre. I did not even have a highway. I was utterly in the woods. I had a roll of diplomas, but they were of no use to me. They meant nothing except one thing, and that is, after all, a thing of supreme value. They represented a real mental awakening. If a man once awakens from his age-long stupor and learns to think, actually begins to think independently, he has accomplished much. Until that time arrives, it can never be said of him that he is an educated man, no matter how many diplomas he may have won or how loudly the world may acclaim his learning. I begin the study of medicine. Being now without a profession that I could sincerely follow, I turned to the study of medicine. That at least was something definite with which I could occupy hands and brain. I won my medical degree from the State University of Iowa and settled on the Pacific coast to practice. But in all the years that followed, my interest in spiritual things never slackened. It rather grew more intense. I must have been born under that star. I sought eternally for the real, for the true. But now I no longer sought for it in organised religion. I no longer expected to find it in the great schools of learning. So I became interested in new thought, in Christian Science, in spiritualism. But none of these seemed to get at the root of the matter. I found in Theosophy a greater appeal than in any of the rest. It held a keen interest. It surely had glimmerings of the light, but much of it seemed so far away and intangible. Its great teachers wrote learnedly and pointed to masters far away in the depths of the Himalayas, where the great white brotherhood controlled the destinies of men. But when I tried to get in touch with some of these great ones, the path of approach always vanished. I took up the study of Rosicrucianism. That also was good. It seemed to point in the right direction. It was deeply fascinating. But in it I could never find the way to the feet of any man who could speak with authority on any of the deeper problems. If they had masters, they were to me quite inaccessible, and I was put off with many vague promises. I continued to flounder about in deep waters, and never seemed quite able to get my feet on a firm foundation. Finally, during a long course of reading, and especially during the study of Oriental philosophy, of the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, etc., the idea of the master gradually took shape in my consciousness. There was the ideal. Standing out among all creeds and systems, yet above them all, was the living master. He represented the highest and the best in actual life, for he had himself actually achieved in his own person the highest ideals of all religions, and by virtue of that achievement, he and he alone could speak with authority on the subject. And the most appealing thing about the master was the idea that by following him, any man might achieve the same results and himself become a master. No one has any monopoly on spiritual attainments. The idea of the master appealed to both reason and intuition. I was quite sure that if there were no such thing as real masters, there ought to be. There must be masters. I became more and more convinced that if I could not find the solution of all my problems in a living master, then that solution could not be found on earth. Further search would be useless, for I had now explored about everything else that offered any rational promise of light. So I began my search for a master. I wrote to everybody in the world that I had any idea had ever seen one. Most of them did not reply, and this list included many Indians who at that time were posing as masters in America and collecting ready cash for a prescription purporting to make their students into masters for so much per head. Those who did reply generally put me off with some vague and indefinite statement. One man, who claimed to have spent years with masters in India, replied, "When you become master of yourself, you are in the presence of the masters." But to one crying in the wilderness, there is not much comfort in that. Once or twice I thought I had found a master, but on closer scrutiny and more critical study, I had to give up and begin my search all over again. But each time I renewed the search with more zeal than ever. In spite of many counterfeits, the real master must be found somewhere. Every good thing in the world is imitated and capitalized on by designing men, and the better a thing is, the more cleverly it is counterfeited. I was now convinced beyond a question that real masters did exist somewhere on earth. Knowing that India has been the reputed home of the masters for ages, I would have set out for India at once. But after arrival in India, I would have had no way of locating the master. I had heard of different men who had gone to India in search of a master and returned disappointed. I believed then, and have since found out for a certainty, that there are millions of people in India who have no knowledge of a real master, perhaps many who have never heard of one. And I now know of scores of people who live less than 3 miles from the greatest master in India, and yet they have not the least idea of a master. They have seen him pass through their villages time and again. They have heard him spoken of as a holy man. And yet they have no idea of his mastership. They pass him by as just one more of the thousands of sadhus who are more or less revered as men who possess certain unusual knowledge and powers, but most of whom are little more than dirty beggars, going about collecting an easy living. The people have been so imposed upon that most of them pay but slight attention when a real master does appear. But my search was a long-distance one, and I just had to go on waiting and searching for a clue. A medical officer in the US Navy. In the meantime, I had spent nearly 3 years as assistant surgeon in the United States Navy during and after the Great War. Later, I settled in California and resumed private practice. I built a hospital of my own and developed a considerable surgical practice. Years passed, and a heavy practice wore on me to some extent. But my interest in the eternal quest never abated. I became entangled in world affairs. I made much money, invested it, and lost it. Complications involving business and domestic difficulties wove about me an intolerable situation. All the while, that inner urge for the eternal realities became more and more dominant and insistent. I became more and more disgusted with the world and its false glamours. It seemed to me that the whole world was rushing on, madly indulging itself, and then, when it got the bellyache, it came to me for a pill or an operation. I was sick of it all. So one day, I rented out my hospital, filled up my gas tank, and all alone, I headed for the south on a vacation. I didn't even tell my most intimate friends where I was going. In fact, I didn't know myself, but I knew I had to have a change and a rest. And a few days later, I drove into a grove of eucalyptus trees in Brawley in the Imperial Valley. The darkest hour of my life. It was then, during the winter of 1928-29, while visiting in the Imperial Valley, California, that the darkest hour of my life came upon me. It seemed as if I had come to the end of all roads, the end of the trail. Ahead there was nothing but the desert, the darkness, and the end. Nothing but blank darkness. Bitterness of soul and despair settled upon me. I was ready to hate the whole world for leading me on in a series of constant disappointments. But finally, realizing that would only make bad matters worse, I at last resorted to humble prayer to that Supreme Father, in whom I had always believed, but who, it seemed to me, had sadly neglected one of his boys. Self-pity and blaming others is such an easy way of sliding out of one's own shortcomings. An ocean of love. Whether my prayers were heard and answered by some gracious divine agency, or whether my attitude of prayer simply brought me into harmony with the divine law, does not matter. The end results are the same. I awoke one morning with a keen realization of having been literally floating in an ocean of love. It seemed to me an actual experience, floating in an ocean of love. I could think of nothing else all day that day. The aspect of the whole world had changed overnight. And the following morning I had the same delightful sensation. It was evident that some vital and transforming change had taken place in me. I looked upon the world with new eyes. I loved everything that lived, and most gratefully, I bowed my soul before the Supreme Father. The long search rewarded. A few days later, the impression came to me like the strokes of a hammer upon my brain that I must go north. So, without further hesitation, I just put a notice on my door, "Too hot, gone north." In fact, the weather was getting pretty warm by that time. I drove over to Pasadena and Los Angeles, and then up the scenic coast route. Returning by the Inland Pacific Highway, I stopped in Ashland, Oregon, to visit an old lady, Julia R. McQuilkin, whom I had known and loved for 25 years. She was then nearing her 80th milestone in life's journey, but her brain was active and her soul radiant. She had lived a long life of useful deeds. Almost the first thing I noticed on entering her sitting room, lying there on her library table, was a copy of Radha Soami Satsang. It struck me peculiarly. I began to read, and one of the first paragraphs my eyes fell upon read, "The Supreme Being is a boundless ocean of spirit or love, and the human being a drop or current of spirit or love from this ocean. And love being the very essence and means of existence of the whole creation, it follows that no effort in any direction, temporal or spiritual, unless actuated by love or affectionate regard, can be crowned with success, and the work or labour rendered easy, sweet, and harmonious." Strangely enough, here was my ocean of love in which I had been baptized, and in the very same paragraph, a complete and perfect explanation as to why I had failed in so many of my undertakings. It came with the force of a personal message from the skies. I continued to read. When lunch was ready, I fed myself with one hand while I held onto the book with the other. I asked questions. Finally, when the little volume had been read through the second time, I asked my friend where she had obtained it. In all philosophical and occult literature, there was nothing like it. It carried a different message. My beloved hostess smiled and said that it was an exposition of the teachings of a master in India. I eagerly inquired, which master? She then told me that for 7 years she had been an initiate of this master, and if I wished, she would give me directions as to how I might get in touch with him myself, if I wished. Would I wish to drink water if I was dying of thirst? At last I was to find a master. I asked her why she had not told me of her master before, when she knew well that I had long been in search of one. She smiled again and said, "You were not ready before." Ah, that was it. I was not ready. Even though I had longed to see the master, I was not yet ready to stand in his holy presence. That was why my guru had not appeared. We are so prone to think of everything else except our own unworthiness. But at last, thanks to that ocean of love and my good friend, I was to find a master. About 8 months from that date, I received instructions from the master himself to proceed to Port Angeles, Washington, for my initiation. I could never convey to another person any adequate idea of the deep gratitude which I felt when this message came. A little over a year from the date of my initiation, one fine day I laid down my surgical instruments, locked the doors of my hospital, and slept soundly that night. The next morning I drove down to San Francisco to take a steamer for India. On the 24th day of March 1932, I sailed out through the Golden Gate, headed for Honolulu and the Far East. Studying Buddhism in Honolulu. I stopped over in the Hawaiian Islands for 2 weeks, but instead of much sightseeing, I put in most of the time studying with a very cultured gentleman by the name of E.H. Hunt, who is an accredited bhikshu, or priest of the Buddhist faith, in charge of the beautiful Hongwanji temple. This faith is well known in the islands, mainly because of the large number of Japanese adherents. But the impression of this writer is that Buddhism, like Christianity, has seen its best days. It has served its purpose in the divine plan, has drifted into formalism, and will eventually disappear as a more vital faith comes to take its place. The journey westward. On the 15th of April, we weighed anchor and slowly moved out of Pearl Harbor while the band played the beloved Aloha. As we sailed away into the setting sun, a gorgeous rainbow formed a perfect arch over the entire city of Honolulu. We accepted that as a hopeful sign, a promise that our quest would not be in vain, and that we should return to American soil with the fruits of success. Under the tricolours of Mikado, our ship set its steady course westward, while we looked fondly upon the last receding speck of land over which floats the American flag. Our outbound party. There were in our party, sailing from Honolulu, 5 Americans outbound on 4 different missions, quite as opposite to each other as the 4 points of the compass. One was a young man, ex-soldier, a lovable, jolly fellow going to Singapore or the Philippines or wherever the ship wished to carry him. His object was to spend time, his youth and money. It mattered not at all. If fate brought fortune, romance or war, he would play his guitar under the southern moon and forget that the world had its problems. He couldn't be bothered. There was another young man of about 30 years of age, educated, affable and a bit serious. For he had read Kant, Schopenhauer, Herbert Spencer, and of course Nietzsche and Ibsen. But in Tokyo he easily found the pretty Japanese girls more interesting than the critique of pure reason. He was willing to agree with Kaiserling that the Japanese had reduced love-making to a fine art, and he had always been interested in the best examples of real art. He was going out to Shanghai to build for himself fame and fortune in the newspaper business. As a journalist and writer of philosophical story, he expected to succeed H.G. Wells, perhaps even blazing the trail into worlds of high thought that Wells had never dreamed of. Such is the boundless optimism and egotism of youth. There was then a middle-aged couple, husband and wife, bound for Tibet as missionaries. They had been called, so they said, to carry the gospel into that almost inaccessible region, which was now the very last outpost of the known world where it had not been preached. This was necessary, they explained, so that in the end those heathen might be properly damned without excuse for their obstinacy when the Lord Jesus should come in all of his glory to judge the world. The Lord was at that moment, they believed, somewhere in the highest heavens, already with his shining host, restraining his impatient angels, just waiting for the day and hour when he and his wife had crossed to the western border of Tibet, preaching as they went. Of course they did not know a word of the language which they were to use in preaching, but that did not matter. Then suddenly the end of the world would come, the terrible judgment, the wholesale destruction of the wicked, and the gathering up of the elect. That select and somewhat exclusive company would consist of only 144,000 out of the total population of the earth. Of course, they had already received their tickets as members of the select party. All the rest of mankind, since the beginning of the human race on earth, were to be cast into hellfire with the devil and his angels. Such was the cheerful outlook of our missionaries. Lastly, there was an elderly man, possessing the intelligence and scientific training of the average American surgeon, a contemplative mood, a philosophical bent of mind, and somewhat of a dreamer, now going out to India in search of a Mahatma, not Mahatma Gandhi. It is astonishing how our friends suddenly become interested in our welfare the moment we start out to do something which they think we should not do. There are always plenty of people standing ready to whip us back into line with the old order. But seldom is anyone willing to help push us out in search of the new. While my friends in America were getting anxious about me, I was becoming quite solicitous about my missionary friends. They were evidently moving straight toward deliberate suicide, fired with a fanatical zeal worthy of any crusader. They had only money enough to take them to Yunnan, and their entire equipment consisted of a few clothes, a roll of blankets, 2 Bibles, and a guitar, which they could not play. They had no organisation supporting them, and no sort of preparation for the rigours of the cold mountain regions ahead of them. They expected Jesus to miraculously enable them to speak the language and play the guitar, to feed and clothe them, and to provide means of travel. They were further handicapped by having with them their little boy, only 5 years of age. I wished to save them, if possible, from a fatal error. So on separating from them at Hong Kong, after trying persuasion in vain, I handed them a letter to be read at their leisure, urging them to reconsider. While my missionary friends were reading the above-mentioned letter, I was reading many anxious messages from America. The following letter will do for a sample. Oakland, California, March 26, 1932. Dr. Julian P. Johnson, care of the American Consul, Hong Kong. Dear Julian, just received your note, too late to meet you. I was out of town for a couple of days. I was much surprised and shocked when I read it. I cannot feature you doing such a thing, and I hasten now to send this letter out, hoping that when it reaches you in Hong Kong, you will have reconsidered the matter and may turn around and come back home. You, an educated man, a skilled surgeon, with many years of experience, a hospital of your own, and a good practice, just to drop it all and start out on a wild goose chase? If it was summertime, I would say the heat had affected your head. Mahatmas, masters, whoever saw one alive? Those birds exist only in the warped imaginations of dreamers. If there were such men in India, certainly such eminent scholars as Swami Vivekananda and Tagore would know about them. Anyway, the Christian faith of your mother, and in which you used to be a minister, should be good enough for you. Why leave the good old USA in search of a chimera among heathen people, in a strange land, and among a million strange gods? It is unthinkable. Come back home and forget it, and settle down and enjoy life while you may. You have many years of usefulness ahead of you yet. Earnestly and affectionately yours, N.W.D. Affectionate warnings unheeded. I fear much that in both cases the benevolent interference was in vain. Only another instance of love's labour lost. We are all such obstinate creatures. We all left Hong Kong bent upon our several errands, and nothing but personal experience will ever convince us that we are in the wrong. My missionary friends will probably leave their bones beneath the drifting snows somewhere in the mountain vastnesses of Tibet, unless indeed a miracle should intervene. And the one in search of a Mahatma sails on serenely over the southern seas bound for India, and whatever discovery there awaits him. In the meantime, totally unmindful of either missionaries or Mahatmas, the beautiful moon climbs the eastern sky, soft breezes blow from the islands of the south, and the Southern Cross beckons us on to Singapore. Tonight we stand on the deck of the steamer and watch the restless waves keep time to the silent march of the stars, just as they have done for 1,000,000 years and more. The arrival in India. It is no part of the plan of this little volume to describe in detail the long journey to India. The space must be reserved for more important matters. The reader may imagine with what emotions the writer beheld at last the outlines of India, dear old India, much loved and much misunderstood India. We enter the muddy waters of the Ganges. Calcutta lies on the distant horizon. Our journey nears its end. Slowly we come to anchor at last, and the American traveller sets foot upon the land which holds so much of either success or disappointment for him. The land of Prince Gautama Buddha, the land of the Vedas, believed by many to be the oldest teaching ever recorded by man, but which are quite modern compared with one other, the land of renunciation and ascetic extremes, the land of Ramchandra and Sita, the land of Kabir and Nanak, the land whence so many world religions have emanated. For even Jesus received his inspiration here. The land of wretched poverty and of immense wealth, the land of pitiful ignorance and also of the keenest brains, the broadest culture and the deepest wisdom to be found anywhere on earth, the land of 1,000,000 gods, and also the land where wise men teach earnest students to become gods. Such is India, the motherland of the world. The story of him who came to India in search of a master will now be continued in the form of a series of letters written to his friends and fellow students in America, giving in some detail his actual personal experiences with the master. The facts set forth in these letters are duly attested by a group of men who occupy the highest positions in the social order. The reader is at liberty to write to any of them for confirmation of any part of this story. The last section of this book will consist of a much condensed statement of the Master's teachings, commonly called Santmat, or the teachings of the saints. It is also called the Path of the Saints, or the Spiritual Science of the Saints, Radha Soami Teachings, the Yoga of the Saints, and many other names. But they all refer to that system which has been taught and practiced by all saints of all ages and countries for countless years. It may be explained that the term saint, Sanskrit sant, as used here, has no reference to canonical saints like those of a church. It refers to a great soul who has learned to live a perfect life among his fellow men, who has mastered himself and made himself free from all limitations on the soul, developed his latent powers, risen to the highest pinnacle of achievement in the spiritual realms, and is now able to conduct his disciples to the same sublime achievement. Such is the real saint or the perfect master, and such is the great master portrayed in the following pages. The masters adopt modern methods. If it happens to occur to the readers of this little volume that this public statement is not in line with the time-honoured method of the masters, let it be noted here and now that the modern saints have abandoned the old rigid rule of secrecy and exclusiveness. The reasons that made it necessary in past ages no longer exist. The saints now make public appeal to modern intelligence using modern methods. They freely give out their message through books and public discourses. The only secrets now withheld from the public are certain instructions given to disciples at the time of initiation and during their further progress on the path. Also the individual personal experiences of the disciples. Those secrets, while vital to the student, would be of no use to the public. To all disciples, the Master's injunction is, freely you have received, freely give. Only do not waste your time trying to give to those who are not ready for it. Use common sense and discretion, tempered with love. It may be well to call attention to one other fact in this connection. Occult students have generally held the idea that the Masters accept disciples only after the most rigid and searching tests, and so generally the disciples of a great Master have been very few in number. But now their methods are different. Great numbers flock to them. Our Master here, for example, has initiated as many as 4,900 in 1 month. The tests are not severe. Almost all true seekers who come to the Master honestly in search of the way are accepted by him. In reality, the Master accepts larger numbers, not because he wishes a larger following, but because he wishes to give to a larger number the golden opportunity of spiritual redemption, no matter if many of them follow but indifferently and die at last straying from the path. If they have been initiated, the seed has been sown, and in the next life they will be more spiritually minded and make better progress. In the following life they will do much better, and not later than the 4th life following initiation, they will, every one, come to the full light. The full story cannot be told. Having now had the inestimable privilege of living for over 16 months in close association with one of the greatest of these saints, the writer is most happy to offer this personal testimony to all who may be seeking the light. The major part and the most vital of all his experiences with the Master must remain untold. They belong in that category of individual experiences which can never be told to another, and if it could be told, would serve no useful purpose. Only the most superficial, the least convincing of all his experiences, the occult student may put into writing. Each student in search of the larger reality must travel the path for himself. The most that even the Master himself can do at first is to point the way. If the soul of the reader is ready for the light, he will not fail to see the guideposts directing him on the way, nor will he ever again pause until he rests at the Master's holy feet. But if he is not ready, he must pass again under the wheel and wait for future ages to bring him to higher levels of consciousness.